Hey guys, you're watching the Best Practices Show, where we take a look at the best business practices from the best dental practices all over the world. And when you create a great practice, you really have to do a good job of documenting. And I've got one of the world experts on documentation. And today we're going to be talking about how we can do dentistry instead of doing time. You know, clinical records prevent criminal records with Roy Shelburne. You cannot miss this. You have to watch this. So do me a favor, grab a pen and hit the share button. We'll see you in a second. Hey guys, thanks for watching the Best Practices Show. We are crazy grateful that you're on today, and today you're going to love this episode. It's taken me a while to get him on, and we finally got him on, and we're just crazy grateful that you're watching. So continue to share, love it. We have over 16,000 followers on Facebook and over 250,000 views a week, and over 6,000 of you have found us on iTunes. So thank you so much, and keep giving us suggestions for shows that you want to see, because we'll get them on. Couple show notes. We are shooting this live on Facebook. So as you're watching this during the live feed, if you have a couple questions, go ahead and add them to the feed, and I'll ask Roy directly, and we'll get the answers straight from him. Or if you're watching this later on, continue to add questions to the feed, and we'll make sure that we get you the right answers to the questions that you need, because we want you to get the most out of this. Now, my guest today has been a friend of mine. I call him the best looking bald guy and he not only is he's a great guy, great speaker, great educator, very well dressed, just a true gentleman in every sense of the word. And I've watched him just completely explode on the education side of things, Roy Shelburne. So, and you really are, you know, I asked you this beforehand, if you're in a category 1, and I don't know if there's a whole lot of people that do what you do, and we're going to describe that in a little bit, but I know your story, but somebody watching this may not know your whole story. So who is Roy Shelburne? Tell us a little bit about you and your journey.
Oh, wow. I was born in a very small town in the western part of Virginia, actually the westernmost county in Virginia, so very isolated. Grew up on a farm. I went to dental school. I enjoyed every bit of dental school. That's what I understand is kind of unusual. I love the whole thing. Graduated from dental school, went back to my hometown and set up my office in my grandfather's hardware store building. He and my grandmother had passed away a couple of years before I graduated from dental school, and the building was available, so we lowered the roof, we put the equipment underneath the floor, we put walls in this open space, and I opened my practice, and I practiced there happily for 27 years. I was a big CE junkie. I like to be able to stay current, so I went to most of the major meetings, and in October of 2003, I'd flown from this small area from the western part of Virginia to San Francisco, California, to the American Dental Association meeting. I was excited about being there. The keynote speaker that year was Rudolph Giuliani, and I had gone to that keynote and was sitting there and was so into what Giuliani was saying that when my phone began to vibrate, I didn't notice it, but the gentleman who was sitting next to me did, and he elbowed me and said, "Sir, I think your phone's vibrating." And I opened my phone, and it identified my wife as the caller, and I thought that was unusual. She was visiting my daughter, who was at Virginia Tech at the time. She wasn't home, and I knew she wouldn't generally interrupt, knowing I was at this meeting. But rather than answering the phone then, I closed it, and Giuliani finished, and he was great, by the way. If you ever have an opportunity to hear him, he's a great speaker. So as everyone else was starting to move out of this large auditorium, I called my wife, and the phone connected, and there was silence on the other end. If you know my wife, she's usually at least 2 or 3 words into the sentence by the time the phone connects. The silence on the other end, I thought she wasn't there, and I said, "Debbie, are you there?" And she said, "Roy, I am. Are you sitting down?" And I don't know if anybody listening has ever had an opportunity to have a phone call like that, knowing that what you're going to hear next was not going to be very good. So I said, "Debbie, do I need to be?" And she said, "Roy, you need to be sitting down." And I said, "Debbie, what's up?" And she said, James had called. James was our custodian at the office. He had called her to let her know the FBI had come to the office. They had battered down the back door, and they were carrying out all my records. kind of knocked the wind out of me. I talked with her for a while, and I tried to reassure her that everything was going to be okay, never believing for a moment it would be, because the FBI just doesn't do something like that unless it's something major. So talked with her for a while. I sat there now in this empty auditorium wondering what in the world I was going to do, and I thought, what the heck, I'll call my office. I did. It was a Friday. None of the staff was going to be there, so I didn't expect anybody to answer the phone, but rang twice, and sure enough, somebody answered the phone. Male voice on the other end said, "Hello?" I said, "Hello, who is this?" Voice on the other end of the phone said, "Who's this?" And I said, "I'm Dr. Shelburne. I own the office that you're in and the phone that you're speaking on. Can you tell me what this is about?" He said, "We have executed a search warrant. You're a target of a healthcare fraud investigation. We're in the process of gathering information to determine whether or not we feel that you have committed healthcare fraud."
Wow.
And I asked, I said, "What is this about?" And even to this day, when I say these words, it makes the hair on the back of my neck kind of stand up. He said, "Sir, you know what this is about." And I said, "I have no idea." I asked him, I said, "Do I need an attorney?" He said, "I can't advise you." I said, "Do I need to be there?" And he said, "I can't advise you." So I hung up the phone, now in California, trying to figure out what I was going to do. I went back to the hotel, packed my bags, went to the airport. There was a seat available on the way home. I flew home, was home at about 9:30 p.m. that evening, drove past my office to find it surrounded by black FBI vehicles and crime scene tape around my practice. My practice was in the largest town in the county, 1,800. That's 1800. Population is about 20,000. That search and seizure happened on Friday. Saturday, the next day, was our county's fall festival. So there were parades through town. There were vendors set up on the street, and guess what the topic of conversation was? That was me.
Wow.
Met with my staff the next day, went to church the following day, Sunday, asked for their support, went to work on Monday. It was in the newspaper, so everybody knew. And we really didn't expect anybody to come because of the occurrence. We huddled in the staff area as we did every morning, and we didn't expect anybody to keep their appointment, but we walked forward, and to be honest with you, almost all those patients kept their appointments. Was investigated for the next 3 years. Periodically, we would get some information that they had subpoenaed information from a business that we had bought equipment from, or from other doctors, or from other people in the community as they did their investigation. In fact, 2 years into the investigation, I got a call from one of my children that alerted me that the FBI had sent 3 teams of officers to the 3 universities. They'd gone to the bursar's office to get their schedules, had enlisted the help of campus police, and then presented to my children's classrooms with badges and said, "We need to interview these students." They pulled my children out of the classroom and interrogated them in an empty classroom. What do you think that did to me as a father? I was devastated. I asked him actually to come home, and we talked about it, and I said, "I'm going to plead guilty because this is going to affect you, and I can't stand to watch that." And one of my children stood up with her finger in my face and said, "If you do that, I'll never forgive you." And the other 3 we're fine. We're going to do fine. And I said, "Well, if I ever see anything that's happening that would suggest to me that you're being limited in what you can do by this situation, I'll pull the trigger because I can't stand to watch that." And before we get done today, I hope you'll allow me to share with you what they've done with their life. I was indicted almost exactly 3 years after the search and seizure. It was October the 27th. The search and seizure happened on October the 24th. 3 years later of investigation, the officer that I spoke to while I was in California, when I called my office, was at my back door. He said, "Dr. Shelburne, I'm here to arrest you." He came with 6 other officers and 3 flatbed car haulers. I was in the kitchen. I was handcuffed. I had a chain around my waist attached to the handcuffs so I couldn't raise them or lower them any further than a couple of inches. I had leg irons on. I was being read my rights. The phone began to ring. My wife was standing next to me. She turned to answer the phone, and the officer stopped her. He said, "Ms. Shelburne, I can't let you answer the phone. We can't let anything interrupt these proceedings, so please don't answer the phone." So she didn't. She turned back around, and she put her hand on my shoulder. The phone rang 4 times. The answering machine picked up, and we could hear On the other end, my daughter, who was at the University of Virginia, she was very distraught. She was crying. She said, "Mom, Dad, they're here. They're taking my car. I don't need my car. What's going on? Is Dad okay? What's going on at home?"
Mm.
I was charged with healthcare fraud, racketeering, money laundering, and structuring. And because I was charged with racketeering and money laundering, it allows the government to confiscate everything you own when you're arrested. So the flatbed car haulers were to pull my vehicles out of the garage and to put them on the car haulers and to haul them away. My wife's vehicle was in her name and the children's vehicles were in their names. So they also confiscated all our bank accounts, so we had access to nothing. So try to put together a support team, pay an attorney and expert witnesses to be able to defend yourself during court. It was very, very difficult. Spent the night in jail. The next day I was arraigned. I was taken to court, and the judge comes in. He asked the prosecutor what the charge is, and the prosecutor outlined the charges, and he asked, had bail been arranged, and he and my attorney had come to a bail agreement. And my attorney had broken the news to me that part of the bail agreement, for them to agree to allow me to make bail and to go home, I would have to surrender my license to practice dentistry. So basically in that moment, I felt my life had vaporized as far as my professional life. But something interesting, a lot of providential things happened during the process, and this was one of those days. The judge asked the prosecutor, had they come to an agreement with bail? And the prosecutor said, "Yes, we have. We've asked that he post this amount of money. We've asked that he surrender his license." Mm-hmm. Typically, he would have looked at my attorney and asked, were there any objections? And my attorney would have said no. He would have hit the gavel and my license would have been gone. But the judge didn't do that. He looked at the prosecutor and asked him, "Does the Board of Dentistry of Virginia still exist?" And the prosecutor said, "Yes." And he said, "Is the board aware of the situation?" The prosecutor said, "Yes." And the judge looked at him and he said, "So you're asking me to supersede the power of another governmental agency that's been charged with the responsibility of determining whether or not doctors can practice appropriately in Virginia. You're asking me to supersede their power. Is that what you're asking?" And the prosecutor looks at him and goes, "I guess." And the judge says, "Until they act on this man's license, he can practice dentistry." So this time, it was everywhere. It made national news. I have a friend that practiced in New Jersey. It was a story in the New York Times. And I expected my practice to be over. Mm-hmm. The best year I ever had financially was the year after my arrest and before my prosecution. You know how you'll diagnose work that patients need, bridges, partials, crowns, and they postpone it for whatever reason?
Right.
Literally, they would come into my practice that whole year and would go, "I know we need this bridge and I want you to do it." And they would look back at me in the chair, "And I don't know if you're going to be here or not, so go ahead and do it now."
Oh my goodness.
So, one of the things the listeners, I think they need to understand is the importance of the relationships you have with your patients.
Yeah.
Given the situation, a patient that did not know me and have a relationship with me, would they ever continue with treatment? Absolutely not. Mm-hmm. But the fact that they stayed with me, to me, is a testament to the fact that relationships trump everything else. There are a lot of people who are promotions goods, sure, are things that you can do to have the patients come in. That's all great. But unless you spend the time developing the relationship with that patient and having them understand who you are and why you do what you do, and hopefully it's for the right reasons, they'll stay with you through even arrests and prosecutions of their dentist. So develop that relationship first and foremost. I think it's important. The trial began about a year and a half later. It was 9 days of what I consider a college education in what you should and shouldn't do in your dental practice in terms of being able to document what you do to support medical necessity and to bill and code appropriately. Mm-hmm. One of the things that was striking to me was how things could be construed one way or the other if it wasn't documented appropriately. It was my word against whoever's word took a look at the work that I provided. There was one count of healthcare fraud, and they brought 118 instances that could have been considered healthcare fraud. So they had 118 opportunities to be able to find me guilty. And the jury, my motive for committing healthcare fraud as presented to the jury was to fund my lavish lifestyle. the jury never knows the amount, and had a busy practice. It was a poor county, so we had a lot of Medicaid patients, and they did an evaluation over the course of 6 years. And over that 6 years, I was paid about $3.5 million for the services that we provided our Medicaid patients. Large number, huge number, obviously. Mm-hmm. But the amount that the government determined, and the jury, it had to be a jury trial. The jury's not made aware of the amount. It's the amount that I got that I wasn't entitled to is established in sentencing. So the amount of the $3.5 million that I was paid, any guess to how much I got that I wasn't entitled to of the $3.5 million?
I don't know. I couldn't even imagine.
$17,899.57. That's 0.05%.
Wow.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
So, and did we get money we weren't entitled to? Yeah. For example, it happened before '05, and before '05 there were 2 codes for extractions. There was a first code, and there were additional extractions at the same visit, kind of like a PA X-rays are now. First PA and then additional PAs. So this happened occasionally, didn't happen all the time, but if we did 3 extractions during a visit, we would all code them as if they were the first one, rather than the first code and then the additional 2 codes for the additional 2 teeth. So for those services, we got $2.64 more than we were entitled to for those services because we coded them incorrectly. Should we have not made that error? Absolutely. Should we have corrected them? Yes. But one of the things that I learned in the process was the definition of intent when it comes to intent to defraud. Mm-hmm. The definition of intent obviously includes an instance where somebody may have submitted a claim for a patient they never saw for a service they never did. That would be intent to defraud directly. But it also includes what's considered blind disregard. That's if you continue to do the same thing the same way without having systems to identify and correct those errors. That is considered blind disregard and intent to defraud. And I was asked what systems do we had to identify the errors and to correct them, and we had none. We had none. So from a legal perspective, that was intent to defraud because I didn't have systems in place to be able to identify and correct those errors. In medicine, quality improvement, quality assessment is something that hospitals are very well aware of, physicians are very well aware of. In dentistry, it's something that is totally foreign.
Right.
Very few offices are aware of the fact. And if you receive government reimbursement of any type, it's mandated that you have a compliance program in place. There's a 7-step compliance program that is recommended. And if they have that in place, it takes the blind disregard off the table. They're actually doing what's considered reasonable to identify and correct errors when they're being made. And in fact, the Affordable Health Care Act stipulates that even if they submit a claim and that claim is processed incorrectly by the administrator, and the administrator pays that dentist or doctor something that they're not entitled to, it's the processor's mistake. It's their mistake. We, as the professional, bear the responsibility of identifying their error and correcting it and sending the money back within 60 days, or you can be found guilty of having gained some type of payment that you're not entitled to. So they can make the mistake and we bear the responsibility. So are we living in a period where there are more dangers than ever before? Absolutely, it is. We need to be aware of them. And I stress that you don't have to be perfect, but you do have to have systems in place to work the system to make sure that you do identify those errors and work very diligently to make sure that they don't continue to occur.
Yeah.
So I was I was found guilty on all charges. I was walking into sentencing. I didn't know how long I was going to have to serve, but they put together a pre-sentencing document that establishes the maximum and minimum established by what you've been found guilty of and any enhancements that might be made as a part of your position. Because I was a dentist and I had a position of authority over my patients, that increased the severity. Mm-hmm. So when I walked into sentencing, the minimum amount of time that I would be sentenced to was 11 years.
Wow. And
the maximum was 27. But there again, something providential happened. Days before I was to be sentenced, the Supreme Court defined a certain word, a single word in the money laundering statute. When my attorney read it, he said, I think the way the Supreme Court had defined this word, it makes it so that it doesn't apply in your case. So he wrote a motion to the judge to set aside the money laundering statutes convictions based on this definition of a single word. So going into sentencing, we didn't know how he was going to rule, but we did know the minimum was that long, 11 years. So the judge started by saying that he was going to deviate from the mandatory, and as soon as he said that, my attorney on my right-hand side groaned, and this paralegal on the left started to cry. And I have found that the judge had deviated in the past, but it was usually upward. So they thought he was going beyond the 27 years. But the judge did agree with my attorney about the money laundering statutes, the money laundering definition. So he took those off, which reduced the minimum amount of time in the guidelines to about 42 months. And he actually ended up sentencing me to 24 months. He actually went below that. He lessened the severity. Like I said, 6 days before I was to be sentenced, had he decided to set the jury's verdict aside, which can be done on a very rare occasion, the prosecution would have had an opportunity to go through the whole process again. I would have been tried again. And by the way, that law was changed in a way that definition of the word would have reapplied, would again apply in my situation about 4 weeks afterwards. So I had a 6-day, 4-week window of opportunity to be sentenced, or I'd still be in prison today. So wow. Providential, you best believe. So what I've done now is committed myself to educating dentistry, the dentist and their staff, to make sure that, number one, you document appropriately so that it captures what was said, what was done, why it was done. That helps to testify for the doctor in the event that there's ever a question. That document can speak very loudly and strongly in support of what you did and why you did it if you choose to make the proper entries. If it doesn't, it's the doctor's word against the other individual's words. And that works in malpractice actions or in criminal cases. That same document can be key to protecting you. And I was not very good at documenting the need for care, what I did, why I did it, so that everything was left to argument. It's kind of like, well, you did it down.
Yeah.
In fact, during the trial, specifically something that related to my documentation, the question was about a service I'd provided for a patient. They had an expert witness that testified if the lesion were not evident on a radiograph, it would not need to be treated. So the dentist was obviously very conservative. So the issue was I did a restoration on this patient, and the lesion was not evident on a radiograph. And so when it came my time to testify, I had to support my position for all those 118 instances that they had cited that could have been construed as healthcare fraud. And this one was on treatment of a tooth that didn't show the need in a radiograph. So my attorney asked me, he said, Dr. Shelburne, would you please describe for the jury what you typically do to determine treatment's necessary? And I went through the whole litany. I said, we start with a visual examination. We take a look at radiographs, although the radiographs are not conclusive. We use instruments like explorers to feel the teeth, and went through the whole litany and did as thorough a job as I possibly could to describe how I went through the decision process of filling a tooth. And then it became the prosecutor's turn to kind of tear apart everything I had said in defense of my treatment of these patients, and got to this particular patient. And he said, Dr. Shelburne, you did an amazing job, a very good job of describing what you do to determine treatment's necessary. By the way, if a prosecutor ever compliments you, what comes next is not going to be very pretty.
Yeah.
So he was setting up the scenario. So he nodded to his AV person, and they projected a copy of my treatment record for the patient on that day that I did the evaluation, the day I did the treatment. He said, Dr. Shelburne, for the sake of the jury, could you identify the day you did the evaluation? And I said, this date, it's listed here. And he said, the day you did treatment. I said, this day and here. And he said, for the sake of the jury, could you identify where you made note that you did any of those things that you so aptly described when you told how you decided treatment was necessary? And I looked at my record and had evaluation that had a list of the services I thought were necessary. I did make note of my decisions, why I decided to make those treatment. And he said, on the treatment day, did you make note of what you observed or why the treatment was necessary? And it just had the treatment that I provided, the materials that I used. and nothing about the reason for why I provided the treatment. And I said, well, I didn't make note of any of those things. He turned very dramatically to the jury with a small grin on his face, and he said, well, now that we find you in this position, I guess we'll just have to take your word for it that you did any of those things, right? Had I taken more time to document more thoroughly my treatment decisions, the diagnosis, that would have reduced the possibility that they would have used that against me during this trial. Same thing about malpractice cases. If it's documented, generally what happens if a patient goes to an attorney and initiates a malpractice suit, the attorney is going to ask the treating doctor for a copy of the records. And if those records are thorough and make a good case for the reason for treatment and the treatment was done appropriately, that case will disappear. But if that attorney gets a record that's not complete, it does not completely identify what was done and why it was done, that leaves reason or leaves wiggle room so that they can actually bring a case against that doctor because there is not enough documentation. So the documentation that will protect you from legal action will also help staff submit claims for treatment that's provided, and it will be paid because the documentation, the diagnosis is there, all the information, the treatment will be concisely held in that clinical record so that that staff member, all they have to do is either make a copy or cut and paste that treatment record with the claim, and it gets paid because all the information's there. So it's going to help, number one, to protect you, but it will also help to get you paid effectively and efficiently.
Wow.
So after having gone through that experience, I've had a great opportunity to speak to a large number of dentists, and my hope is that I'm the last dentist that will ever go to prison as a result of their ignorance, because ignorance is no excuse.
Right. And I'll just say this, if you haven't had Roy speak to your club, you got to, because it's powerful. You're an incredible educator. Now, can you speak to why this is so important with all the trends happening too? Because we're going to get into some of the details, but Roy, you get a chance to go everywhere and meet with dentists. There's a lot of this stuff going on, and I hear bits and pieces, and I'm like, what? Like, people, it's a big, big deal, isn't it?
Oh, it's a huge deal. There are, in certain states, RAC auditors who are paid by companies who come in and audit dentists, and they are actually reimbursed on the amount that they find that is done inappropriately. So it's in their benefit to find as much as possible. So we live in a world where there's more risk. Well, for example, I go to the dental insurance meetings as well as the dental meetings because I want to kind of get behind the curtain and to understand their concerns and what they're looking at, some of their focuses are. So I go to the National Association of Dental Plan meeting, which is the insurance companies. It's like their ADA, the American Dental Association, but except for insurance companies. And the AADC, the American Association of Dental Consultants. Those are the consultants who are dentists who work for the insurance companies that review our claims to determine whether or not they should be paid, or and for processing purposes. So listening to them, it gives me a great insight into what they feel the problems are in dentistry today. And one of the greatest are radiographs. They feel that dentists take them too frequently and that they are unnecessary. So for the documentation piece for radiographs, number one, you need to identify why they're necessary, medical necessity. And if you need a document to be able to kind of use as a foundation, the American Dental Association and the FDA in cooperation in 2008, and it was updated in 2012, have a document that outlines what's considered necessary in terms of diagnosis for those radiographs, and it also gives you a grid, patient risk across one, patient age across the other, and it will give you a box that suggests what would be the standard of care in terms of radiographs for that patient. So in establishing your medical necessity for those radiographs, that's a good document to be able to use. Doctors need to determine need for the radiographs before they ever expose their patients to that, and that can be based on that document or clinical knowledge or some other factor. They need to establish why they're taken, and certainly not because the insurance company will or will not pay for them. I see frequently treatment decisions being based on reimbursement, and certainly is that an issue to the patient? Certainly so, but as a dentist, we need to provide care based on that patient's need, based on what we observe in their mouth as would be considered appropriate for that patient. So there again, you have a patient at high risk who has a lot of decay in their mouth. Should you take more frequent radiographs? You should. For patients who have not had any issues for a number of years, should you expose them to radiographs every year? Probably not. So it should be based on their needs. So number one, in your documentation, you need to establish the medical necessity for the radiographs. Number two, they need to be taken and diagnostic. I have a client who gave me a call. They had an audit from an insurance company because it was actually triggered by the fact that they had sent a PA to periapical radiograph to the insurance carrier in justification for a crown that the patient needed on tooth number 2. Mm-hmm. The radiograph that they sent to the insurance company to document the need was not a good one. It was not diagnostic. It would not have passed in any clinical exam for a dentist. So the person who reviewed that looked at that x-ray and said, I wonder if they think this is diagnostic. If we look at their records, what we're going to find. So they did an audit of this practice. They asked for 20 patient charts. They found out that 15% of the radiographs that were taken for these patients were non-diagnostic. So they used that 15% as a multiplier. They went back 6 years. They tallied all the reimbursement they had made for radiographs to this particular dentist for the 6-year period, and they asked for 15% of those payments back. So this doctor wrote a check to the insurance company for $52,000. So, number one, they need to be medically necessary. Number two, they need to be of diagnostic quality. And the third is that the doctor read them, that they were actually reviewed.
All right. Now, that's a big deal, too, though. Like, yeah. I mean, yeah. Okay, keep going. This is good stuff.
So, there again, in order to be able to, number one, document appropriately, you have to go through all those steps. Number one, the doctor's thinking why those radiographs are necessary. And the doctor has to make that diagnosis prior to their being taken. There are only 2 states in the nation where hygienists can diagnose. That's Idaho and Oregon, and they have to have a special recognition to diagnose independently. They can read radiographs. They can order radiographs. In any other state, only the doctor can do that. So the hygienist can suggest, perhaps, to the doctor that radiographs might be necessary for a particular reason. Patients who have a complaint or whatever that might be. But the ultimate decision has to be with the doctor prior to exposing that patient to the radiograph. And secondarily, like I said, they have to be diagnostic. If you have one that would not pass a proficiency in dental school or in assisting school or in hygiene school, that probably does not need to be billed for. Well, it doesn't need to be billed for because that is a worthless service from the insurance point of view. And this is a bit technical, but I think we need to probably throw that out there. We need to track the patient's exposure to radiographs. Okay. So the offices should actually adopt a code, an in-office code for a non-diagnostic radiograph so that you can track the patient's exposure to the radiographs, but those should not be submitted to the insurance for reimbursement. So, for example, a patient comes in and is complaining of pain on the upper right-hand side. The doctor takes a quick look and asks the assistant to take a PA. The first PA is taken. It's not real great, so the doctor says, not what I need to see, take another one. The second one's taken, and this may never happen in any other part of the country than my office, but the second one was worse than the first one. So they end up taking the third one. The third one's perfect. And I'll usually quiz my attendees, and I said, how many do you bill for? And the answer is almost always correct. You bill for one. There's only one that's diagnostic. How many do you make note that were taken? You should do the 3. And that should actually be tracked. Doctors, you may not know that that patient had 4 films taken to get one good one. The assistants or hygienists will know enough to only, show the doctor one of them, but the patient, of course, knows that they've been exposed to 4. Mm-hmm. So if you have a staff member that is not as effective in the radiographs, that's an opportunity for an education to help them to become better at what they do. So by tracking that, that's going to give you that information. That documentation is going to help in your efficiency as well as the staff's proficiency
Right.
So usually get that answer right, but I also ask questions about a patient who maybe comes in is missing number 1 and number 2, and on the bottom, number 31 and 32, that's second and third molars. So have no molars, whole no teeth posterior, the first molars. So 4 bite wings are taken, distal of canine into the premolar or in the molar area, and then the second bite wing on this side is middle of premolar back into the edentulous area. On the right-hand side, the distal of canine into the molar area, and then the second one's taken the premolar area back into the edentulous area. And I ask the attendees, how many do you've taken for, how many do you bill for? And generally the answer is 4. However, the second one on the right-hand side, where you're missing the second and third molars, it really doesn't give you any other information that typically you would take a bite wing for. So you've taken 1 worthless film. So if you've taken bite wings in an edentulous area, or perhaps you have patients that have space between their teeth. A lot of times children will have spacing between their primary molars so that you can actually see and get an explorer in between to determine if there's any decay there. For those patients, you probably don't need to take a bite wing on, so you've actually taken a worthless film in that way. So I usually ask, how many of you now feel like you may have committed healthcare fraud? And all of them get kind of squirmy in their chairs, because I bet you every single office has taken a film and have billed for it that from a reimbursement standpoint would be considered a worthless film.
Mm. Wow.
So you need to take a look at those as well to make sure that, number one, they're medically necessary, that they are of diagnostic quality, and a notation there that the doctor read them. Because unless it says that the doctor read them, if it's not documented, it didn't happen from a legal standpoint.
Mm-hmm. Wow. So many questions. I got a question here from our friend Deepak. You know, a lot of times you think, and I can certainly appreciate this question, that there's a software, there's an app. You know, everybody says there's an app for everything.
For that.
Yeah, there's an app for that.
Yeah,
now, Deepak asked this question, which is a great one. Documentation is so important. Any software or voice dictation that you recommend?
You know, there are a lot of very good ones out there. There again, it depends on your voice and your intonations. One that might work for me will not understand the thing my wife says. So yeah. I would do a little bit of searching and just use it to find out if, in fact, you know, I'm from the South, the Southern accent's going to trick one system and maybe recognize it. So there are a couple or 3 very good ones. You have to be careful to make sure that it recognizes as applicable in a particular situation, because there might be a little bit of background noise. If in a quiet room, it might be able to do it appropriately. In a noisy room, it might not do as well. So there again, as far as 1 or 2 stands out, it's all varies on who's speaking and where you're communicating to that unit.
Yeah. So it's a great question, because and you know, the whole point is that you have to do, I always say there's only one way to do anything, to do it the right way the first time. And because of all these pressures, Roy, do you see a lot of pressures with dentists now that the way they practice, maybe the dead or things, or I just look at the speed at sometimes people are practicing, they're skipping steps, and they're good-hearted people, but it's very dangerous. Would you agree?
Oh, it's terrifying. And to be honest with you, I don't recommend that the doctor do their own documentation. The staff should be trained and should be adequately and appropriately able to make any notation that is considered appropriate. And the easiest way to do that is doctors communicate when they're speaking to the patients, and have that assistant be trained to be able to capture that conversation. For example, when the doctor sits down to do an evaluation, he says, "Mr. and Ms. Patient, I'm going to do an oral cancer screening." So whoever's listening, either hygienist or assistant, goes, "Doctor conducted oral hygiene or oral cancer screening." And then the doctor says, "Well, I don't see anything except this small area on the roof of your mouth. It's a little red there. Can you tell me a little bit about that?" And the patient goes, "Well, I think I may have burnt that on pizza, maybe a couple of nights ago." And the doctor says, "Well, that may be the case, but if it's not gone, can you see it here in the mirror?" And they go, "Yes." "If that's not gone in a week or so, give me a call back. We may need to go further." The doctor, if you're as busy as most doctors are, you're running with your hair on fire all day. So as far as being able to take the time to capture that, probably not going to happen. But your assistant has listened to that, and they're actually making that entry while you're having that conversation. And it takes no time for the doctor, and it just takes a bit of training with a staff member. And if they sign that record, that document, as well as the doctor, that's twice as powerful as just the doctor making the entry and signing it. And all entries should be made while the patient is in the chair before they leave. And that's one way to make sure that it happens, by having somebody else listen and capture that information during the process, rather than the doctor having to find time during the day, at the end of the day, or heaven forbid on the weekend, to come in and complete all their records.
Yeah.
That's also going to do another thing. It's going to give those people who are collecting the co-pays the accurate information to be able to collect that from the patient and give accurate information as far as billing to the insurance carrier.
Right.
For example, the treatment record had indicated that there was an MO that was on number 4, but before you got done, the doctor opened it up and it actually extended the distal, so that MO became an MOD. And if that's not corrected and sent forward before the patient is left in that insurance process, it's going to be incorrect, and there's going to need to be some correction after that. So at the time the patient is in the chair is the best time to capture that information.
Yeah, and now I'm having all these flashbacks in my brain. I mean, I can't tell you, this is before we went electronic. You know, you get in the car with a periodontist and they'd have charts in their back seat for like 3 weeks. I'm like, yeah. I can't remember what I did yesterday. And they're like, oh, yeah. I can remember all this. I'm like, no, you can't. Well, and then in practice management, we always joke when the documentation WNL within normal limits is really
we never looked.
We never looked, you know. Yeah. Now that's a joke, but it's not a joke, you know.
And unless it makes note that it was done, then you didn't do it. So, like I said.
Wow. Now you've got those. These are 3 elements. But let's say if you could. Let's say I'm a young dentist and I'm watching this and I'm freaking out a little bit. Okay. What advice would you give me, Roy? Like, I'm 32. I just purchased a practice. I'm like, and I'm trying to get everything over to the digital format as much as possible. Like, what would you tell me? Like, give me a treatment plan, some simple things I can get started on in addition to what you've already shared.
Well, number 1, you need to develop what your expectations are. You need to sit down and put together what you consider a complete documentation for whatever that visit is. So for an initial evaluation, these are the boxes, these are the highlights that need to be addressed. I'm not a big proponent of huge groups of information templates that are pulled in, because that would suggest that all your patients are the same, and they absolutely aren't. Mm-hmm. So they need to be broad enough but flexible enough so that the information can be captured so that nothing's missed and it's complete and customized to that patient. Right. So I would consider doing lists. Most of the software, to that young dentist, I would spend the time being able to configure that software, the documentation, the clinical portion, so that it is easy. And most of the time they will allow you to put templates, and even with drop-down windows. So for example, I almost never see a lot of scaling and root planing. I see a lot of periodontal treatment, but I almost never see a complete periodontal diagnosis. So there are 3 variables to a complete periodontal diagnosis. It's either mild, moderate, or severe. That's one set of variables. It's chronic or acute, another set of variables, and it's generalized or localized. So a complete diagnosis for a periodontal condition would be something like severe, generalized, chronic periodontal disease. Mm-hmm. That's a diagnosis. Now, I do see a lot of tooth charts. I see a lot of probings, but there's no diagnosis. You need to diagnose the condition before you treat it. And that's one of the instances where I don't see that. So your software can actually have drop-down windows in those instances where you can click, 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 and you've got that complete diagnosis for that patient. Mm-hmm. And the coding is actually becoming more dependent on the diagnosis as well. There's a new code this year, 4346, that is scaling in the presence of moderate to severe generalized inflammation. Okay. So that diagnosis has to lead to that treatment. So it would either be moderate to severe generalized inflammation. And if that's in the clinical record, then that would justify the 4346, that scaling in the presence of that condition. If you haven't diagnosed that, and for example, you're audited and that diagnosis doesn't appear and you've billed for that service, they'll look at what you billed for and say, your clinical record does not justify this treatment, so we're going to ask for your money back.
Mm.
So make sure that your records are complete and that they're flexible. Leverage software. Leverage your software and train your staff so that you have people who are capable of listening and making the documentation. And doctors will become very aware of that way of doing it. So they speak and the assistant's listening, and the patient is just aware the doctor is concentrating on them.
Mm-hmm.
And when you say that out loud, that's going to do two things. It's going to alert your staff member that was done so they could document it, but the patient's also made aware that they had an oral cancer screening. A lot of times we as dentists do it just as part of our protocol, but we haven't told the patients, and if you haven't told them, they don't know that they got it. And I've actually had patients, I've told them I'm doing oral cancer screening, and they go, wow, I've never had one of those before. That you do that every time? And I said, yes, which alerts to me that more than likely they've had them in the past, but the doctor has not told them, so that they think, you're the first one. You're the best dentist I've ever had. You do an oral cancer screening on top of looking at my teeth.
Right.
So that's going to help your staff to be able to document that, but also your patient to appreciate something that you've done over and above.
Yeah. And I think the due diligence of this, number one, I love how you said that it's expectations, not only with the patients and your team members. I would also add this, and maybe you could, you got to be nice to your team, because I can't tell you how many times I've heard a dentist just got arrested because he tried to fire a team member. Team member goes, oh, you're going to fire me? Oh, watch this, Mr. Man. And they make a phone call. Because a lot of the legal stuff, I'm sure you could appreciate this or maybe add to this. A lot of the legal stuff we see in dentistry, it's emotionally fueled. It's not necessarily a logical step-by-step thing. Would you agree?
Absolutely. I tell everybody, what is the number one thing you can do to eliminate or almost eliminate or eradicate any malpractice action against you?
What?
Have patients like you.
If they like you, they're not going to sue you, right?
Yeah, they will not. They understand, and like I said, the relationship. And do people mess up? You do. Yeah. Even the most perfect dentist is going to, have an issue once in a while. And patients understand that you're human. And if you have that relationship, they'll allow you to correct it. It's fine. It happened. Let's fix it. Let's move forward. So yeah, you need to, number one, back at the beginning, have that relationship with the patient so that they like you. Patients that like you pay their bills. They refer patients to you, and they don't sue you.
Right.
But you're exactly right. Doctors, if you're playing the fringes and do something a little bit off the books as far as your billing goes, and you have an opportunity where you have a staff member, you have to let them go, that's going to come back to haunt you. So number one, be a person of character and do things the right way so that that door is not open. They don't have leverage to go, okay, you do this, I'm going to do this.
Right. Now, and so many other things I want to ask you. Deepak asked this question too. Can you come in? DDS equals Doctor of Dental Stenography. Does this protect posture harm, patient care? Question. If
it's done appropriately, it doesn't. In fact, it will enhance patient care. Especially, we're seeing more and more practices have multiple doctors.
Okay.
So the better you document, the better you convey that information to subsequent treaters,
right?
So that you don't drop the ball. The other person who follows up is aware of those conversations, aware of what's transpired, and it puts you in a better position moving forward. You have the information that you need. Without having that information, that's like a new patient when that subsequent treating doctor sees the patient. So it actually helps to elevate the care that you provide the patient by giving that basis for the conversation, the information that you've gathered in previous meetings, and the services that you've provided. Great questions.
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. And I run into this. I don't know if you see this, Roy. If you're a young dentist, listen to what Roy's saying. And I see the resistance sometimes from, let's say, a 32 or 30 year, they buy a practice. Well, they inherit the team and the way that it's been done. And they feel like they're really rocking the boat by trying to do it. They're like, well, he didn't do it this way. I don't want to upset anybody. I mean, you have a legal obligation to make sure that the business you just purchased is doing it the right way, because the dentist that did it that way didn't even, I mean, they were still using a pegboard when they got started. You know what I mean? So
absolutely. And I'm going to give a little bit more leverage to the doctor suggesting to his team that it's important for them to come on board too.
Right.
There have been subsequent actions against other dentists where staff members have been named as well. So even though the doctor is ultimately responsible, can the staff be named in those actions? They absolutely can. Racketeering and money laundering are considered schemes that are carried out by groups of individuals. So they can actually indict the janitor, the assistants, the business manager, and they have done that in the past. So is there sufficient reason for everybody to be on board in the staff? There absolutely is, because we all ride that same train. We pull together and we support one another, and we do what we do most effective and efficiently when we work together as a team.
Yeah. Now I get to see, I have so many questions again. So I get to see you, and you're speaking everywhere, and you talk to dentists. They love talking to you about this. What are some of the class? Well,
they hate it.
They hate it. You're kind of like the police officer at the junior high. You know, you don't make eye contact.
Exactly.
You kind of walk by. Yeah. What are some classic mistakes you see, other than what we've already talked about?
Failure to capture the information. There are conversations that occur outside the doctor's purview that the doctor needs to be aware of. So when a patient calls in with a chief complaint, if they reveal that information to a representative of the doctor is responsible for reacting to that information. So number one, they need to document everything that's pertinent and have all staff members that are involved in that patient contact be aware that there's a responsibility for them to also capture that information. And number two, to have those systems that I mentioned in place to be able to audit what's going on. That would be both your documentation as well as your billing and coding, to make sure that errors, once they are identified, that you correct them. And number one, you figure out, why did it happen in the first place? Is it a system problem? Is it a time problem? Address that. And then subsequently, when you do a reevaluation or a re-audit, you visit that again to make sure that that error that you identified prior has been corrected and doesn't occur anymore, and then continue to review for any other areas of improvement. It's a continuous improvement process, but it's not enough just to be able to correct that single error that you might find. You have to go through the process of going, okay, this error is being made. Why is this happening? We need to figure out what is broken in our system and be able to identify moving that forward. So young doctors, you need to determine what your expectations are and then make a system to make sure that you meet that expectation every time. It's like team members, it's like family, it's like children. You don't get what you expect, you get what you accept. Right. So if you set your expectations, this is what my expectations are. If you accept half of that, you get half of that. So make sure doctors, once you establish that expectation and get agreement from the staff that they say, yes, we understand, yes, we can do this, but also give the staff an opportunity to be able to give you feedback. There may be something that they don't have or that they need to be able to meet your expectations. Listen to them. And if they need more time, if they need the software, if they need a template to be able to enter that, to be able to make that more effectively, provide what they need to be able to meet your expectations. It's one of those to make, this is what I expect, but it's another thing to make sure that they have what they need. Training, equipment, support, they can actually hit that expectation every time.
Because you will wear the discrepancy between what you expect and what you accept, and that is a tough jacket to wear sometimes. Now, another,
and I'm going to throw this out there, doctors. If you have an expectation of your staff, you have to be there with them. So if you have a staff huddle in the morning, 15 minutes before the patient comes, doctors, you're there 20 minutes before, and you make the coffee, because that will convey to the staff just how important that is to them. Yeah. Same thing with the clinical records, doctors. If your staff member's busy and you kind of shorthand it when you do that, and they come back and review it and go, that doesn't look very good, doc. You need to understand that you are held by the same standards that you set for your staff.
Right. Now, on the topic of shorthand, we're getting some great questions in here, Roy. Let's talk about shorthand for a second. Deepak said, I recommend to dentists that they document like crazy and they use abbreviations and as much shorthand as possible. When you were in court, did you feel the shorthand would suffice or appear as cryptic trickery? and be a disservice? Like,
love this question.
That's a great one. Oh.
And what you do in your practice is do a log. Excel spreadsheet, alphabetized on the left-hand side. The column next to it has the deciphering of that cryptic, whatever that is. And if you have that, you're great. And what that's going to do is two things. Number one, if you have a staff member, for example, a hygienist has worked in another office and doesn't know what your hieroglyphics mean, they can go to this key and go, oh, that's what this means. So they can decipher that and become familiar with. And if you refer that patient to a specialist, they're confused by your shorthand too, because we all use kind of a little bit different shorthand. Just like you said, the W&L, that could mean we never looked.
Right.
If you have that key where it has all your alphabets, your shorthand here, and then the explanation in completeness on the other hand, that people can do that, that's absolutely fine.
Right.
If you don't document it, if they can't refer to that and be able to decipher it, that's trickery. But if it's established and that's what you have established in your practice as being correct, you're fine. You can use as much shorthand as you want, as long as it is understood and that there's some documentation, some log that says this is what this means in our office.
Right. That is great advice, Roy.
Yeah, now, great question.
Now I have so many, this is your area of expertise, not mine, about the audit. You know, sometimes in a financial audit, like your accountant will say, there are a couple rules we follow. You're not going to be present. You know, a lot of these things, I've never been audited, but you know, the thing, first of all, how likely is it for a dentist to be audited? And then if they're audited or when, do you have a protocol? Do you have suggestions on what they should do when this happens?
Sure. Yeah. No, they may say that the random audits, from my point of view, there's no such thing as a random audit.
Okay.
Generally what happens, the only information insurance companies share with one another is submissions data. Mm-hmm. So every time a doctor submits a claim to an insurance company, they are tracked. There is a bell curve that's generated, and Dr. Average is smack in the middle of that bell curve. For example, they have histories on the number of surgical extractions that are done opposed to regular extractions in a GP's office. And the middle of that bell curve, average doctor does, say, 30% surgical extractions as opposed to 70% simple extractions in the clinical office. If they receive claims for a doctor and their average is 90% of their patients get surgical extractions as opposed to 10 to regular extractions, that's going to send a red flag to the insurance company that says there's something going on in this practice that puts them out of the norm. That will generally generate an audit. And audits can result in recoupment. They'll ask for money back. They may just rattle your cage a little bit and say, this is a concern of ours. If they feel like they paid you inappropriately, they're going to ask for that money back. If you're not in network, if you don't participate, do you have to cooperate? You don't.
Okay.
But your life will never be the same as it relates to that insurance company. Every single service you provide, if you do not cooperate with that insurance company, they will put you on focused review, and everything that you do will be scrutinized at a level you would not believe. You're going to have to do all kinds of narratives for the simplest things that generally don't have to be documented. So your life will never be the same.
Okay. Very interesting stuff, buddy. I love this. There are so many topics I want to cover with you. And I got to note that the audio may have gone out, and this Facebook is always a little finicky. So we do have this full episode recorded as a video, and for some reason, if anything dropped out, we'll post it on YouTube so everybody will be able to see it. But I do want to ask this, sure. I'm sure people that are watching this are going to have specific questions for you. And I want to ask you just about your services, because you not only do speaking, but you also do consulting. So if people are struggling with this, how does your process work? Do you go to their offices and do you help them with this?
Yeah. I can do as much or as little as they want to. As far as simple questions on the phone or email, it's usually better to email me. Don't mind answering simple questions. As far as the auditing piece, I can do independent audits if they'd like. I can also help them set up compliance programs in their practice. I can help with soup to nuts as far as the documentation piece. As far as office training, I can go ahead and do those. I like to be able to, once I've done an audit and there's an opportunity to be able to help them improve, I like to be able to spend some time. If if the office is electronic, I could do those virtually. So it's just a matter of accessing their software, going in and reviewing the information. If they're papered, they either have to document them and send them to me, or I can go on site. It just depends on what they want to do. So I can do either or.
Okay.
And as far as the services, like I said, the sweet spot as far as the documentation piece to make sure that they do substantiate what they've done, and the other is the billing coding to make sure that they're compliant.
Yeah. And at the very least, if you have a study club, you got to get Roy out just for a full day. Now, this stuff is a little freaky, but it's so good to have, you're a great way to have this conversation, because this can be sticky sometimes. And it's a great way to have you there and describe why this is so important, some things you need to cover. And then the following Monday or Tuesday, you as a team, if you're a dentist, you can say, hey, look, let's just talk about what happened on Friday. And you'll see the holes in your own practice. And I just look at you as the easy way to open the conversation,
That would be my desire, to help, number one, to illuminate the fact that there are issues. But like I said, do you need to be perfect? You don't. A lot of people say, well, I can't be perfect. And you don't have to be. The whole issue is you need to be trying. And by having a compliance program in your practice, that would convey to anybody who comes in, they're not wanting to make mistakes. Look, they have this implemented. They're doing everything that's considered reasonable and appropriate to identify them and correct them. So worst case scenario, if you have gotten something you weren't entitled to, write a check back and all's fine. You're not going to have them batter down your back door and take your records, and you end up spending 19 months in federal prison. So that would be a nice alternative. Well, I get a lot of pushback sometimes. They go, this takes so much time to be able to do. I had 19 months that I should have had if I spent more time being able to develop what I needed to. Right.
So, and you told me this, take the time so you don't have to do time. Buddy, I really appreciate you, and you're just an incredibly positive light in this world of dentistry, and of all the things that happened to you, I'm so glad to call you my friend, because you've made the best of some of these things that have come your way, and you're helping a lot of people. So thank you.
Well, I'm in a great place in my life. I've been given a great opportunity to hopefully make a difference by using what I've been through as an example. Like I said, I hope I'm the last dentist that ever goes to prison for stupidity. Yeah, well, I think you're incredibly sharp. So stay on here for a second, just Roy, because there's so many things I want to cover with you. And talk about other episodes, and we'll say goodbye to everybody else. But if you're watching today and you have questions for Roy, please add them to the feed, or you can contact Roy directly. We've got his website attached right here to the actual show notes. And if you enjoyed today, do me a favor, just hit the share button, because this is great information I'd love to share with a lot of other dentists and just help them. And also, if there are other shows you want us to do with Roy on specific topics, let us know, and I'll get them lined up, and we'll get Roy to talk for a while. So he's wildly entertaining and incredibly smart. So until we see you next time, keep watching the Best Practice Show. You guys have a great evening.